We begin our look now at the American Revolution. The Declaration of Independence, remember, was the formal recognition by the Second Continental Congress that the ongoing war was now about breaking away completely from British control. But Britain wasn't outright granting their permission for that. The colonists were actually going to have to fight for it and win their freedom. They didn't necessarily think they could win by themselves and were actively seeking friends to help fight their battles, which is also why the Declaration was worded the way it was, that they wanted to prove to possible allies that George III was a tyrant and that it wasn't about just throwing off a monarchy. Despite the fact that the British military had no clear plan for how to win the war with America, the war did not go well for America initially. The blockade of the major ports hampered the ability of the Continental Army and the militias to get needed supplies, and the Continental Army itself had to be completely created from scratch, as it was made up of militia, who of course were never full-time soldiers, and had previously always simply responded to a crisis and then went home when it was over. In the vain hope of rallying the support of Canada, an attack was launched on Quebec, but the struggle for the militias under General Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold exhausted the troops, delaying their arrival until winter, and a smallpox outbreak further decimated the soldiers, who were also due to be released from service very shortly. Ultimately, the attack failed, and over 400 men were taken prisoner. Seizing their opportunity, British forces attacked, driving the Americans back into New York and New England. Not long after, British regulars arrived at Long Island, easily capturing it because it was completely undefended. With 427 warships, 32,000 soldiers, 1,200 cannons, and 10,000 sailors, the largest seaborne military expedition in history to this point, they would face off against 19,000 militia and new recruits. It was a humiliating defeat, but could have been much worse if the British Army had moved quicker in their control for New York. Washington's army was able to escape Manhattan, and if not for the courageous actions of the Maryland 400, who launched an attack on this British army in order to allow the rest of the colonial army to escape, if it hadn't been for that Maryland 400, the entire rebellion could have been crushed before it had barely begun. For their efforts, though, the Marylanders had all but about 10 of their number killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Thomas Paine, hoping to inspire more to join the military effort, had written, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph." Now many had joined Washington's army, but with winter arriving, many of the rebels reportedly without shoes or stockings, and some without even proper shirts, many of them had then left to tend their farms and businesses. Washington desperately needed a victory in order to convince them to come back in the spring and to convince new recruits to join the effort. That victory would come when Washington decided that the morale of his men and the hopes of the nation needed for him to gamble with a wintertime attack. On the night before Christmas, he led about 2,400 soldiers packed into small boats across the Delaware River into New Jersey to attack the British outpost of Trenton, where Hessian soldiers guarded the garrison. It was a total rout of the roughly 1,500 Hessians, who were mostly drunk and sleeping. Only about 500 would escape. Washington lost just 2 men. He was able to gain valuable supplies, including food, blankets, medicine, weapons, ammunition, gunpowder, and prisoners, who could be exchanged for more supplies in the future. A week later, his men crossed the Delaware River again and attacked Princeton, again succeeding, outnumbering the British at that location by a ratio of about 5 to 1. it inspired a new wave of Americans to sign up for service in Washington's army. 1777 would prove to be a crucial year for the war effort, as the British were anxious to prove that they, the most powerful army in the world at that time, could defeat their own colonies. New York City was firmly in control of the British, and they hoped to demoralize the Americans into surrendering, scattering the troops by capturing the de facto capital of Philadelphia. Sir William Howe would lead the campaign to oust Washington from the Philadelphia area, and even though he was heavily outnumbered, Washington would have no choice but to engage. Now, Howe could have attacked from several routes that would have left him available to assist John Burgoyne in the north, who was actually expecting Howe to come and assist him. But Howe would take a much more time-consuming route down to the Chesapeake Bay, and didn't tell Burgoyne with enough notice for him to adjust his plans accordingly. Washington would ultimately face Howe in several battles to try and protect Philadelphia, and was ultimately defeated. But Howe failed to follow up on those victories and destroy Washington's army, even though he would have been able to. From Howe's point of view, the Americans were just pockets of resistance that would scatter if seriously challenged, so he really didn't feel as if he had to go that extra step in destroying them completely. Instead, Howe opted to settle into Philadelphia for the winter, enjoying the lavish attention bestowed upon him and his officers by loyalists who were present in the city. And of course, the Continental Congress scattered, relocating to York in Pennsylvania. Washington, meanwhile, retreated into winter quarters at Valley Forge. Poor conditions and supply problems resulted in the deaths of some 2,500 troops and more than 700 horses. Clothing, too, was wholly inadequate. Many soldiers who were wounded from previous battles would die from exposure. Long marches had destroyed their shoes, blankets were scarce, tattered garments were seldom replaced. At one point, these shortages caused nearly 4,000 men to be listed as unfit for duty. Still more deserted, probably returning to their farms and businesses, resulting in a loss of more than half of his fighting strength. Of course, part of the reason for the supply problems was the fact that the Continental Congress had no money, as it was unable to tax the citizens. Eventually, with the British in Philadelphia, that was going to make it difficult for them to try and get supplies and arrange for supplies to be delivered to the army. But late winter and early spring finally saw a change, with more supplies beginning to reach the military as the Continental Congress organized itself, and an effective training program begun, having been devised by Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a skilled Prussian drill master who had recently arrived from Europe at the behest of Benjamin Franklin, who was in Paris attempting to negotiate an alliance. Now, this is just a closer look at some of the weapons of the day, including muskets, which were the most commonly available guns for both soldiers as well as the militia. Although, remember, a very small percentage of American militia had rifled muskets. Bullets were usually made of lead and could be made by the militia or the army themselves over a campfire, using molds that most soldiers carried. As for the soldiers and militia that became sick or wounded, there really wasn't a lot that could be done. Medical technology was very primitive and generally only consisted of pain medication, bloodletting, and amputation for severe wounds or breaks. Remember, anesthesia was not really yet invented, at least not anesthesia the way we think of it. Alcohol could be given as a means of making it easier for someone to face an operation. Pain medication could be given in large enough quantities as to render a person senseless. And it's also important to remember that antibiotics were not yet invented. Those won't even come about until the 20th century. Meanwhile, to the north, British General John Burgoyne was carrying out a plan to isolate New England so that the British could concentrate on the central and southern regions where supposedly loyalists could be rallied. To carry out his plan, Burgoyne was going to march along Lake Champlain in the Hudson River Valley with the plan to converge upon Albany, New York, with Howe meeting him to provide supplies and reinforcements coming up from New York City. He was able to capture Fort Ticonderoga, but facing a serious supply problem caused largely by Howe's decision to attack Philadelphia so late and then stay there, Burgoyne was forced to send out search parties looking for goods. And it was those search parties that would be subsequently targeted by American forces in the area. In fact, Burgoyne was going to lose more than 1,000 men to U.S. forces, either being captured or killed. Eventually, Burgoyne would blame his Native American allies for the killing of a Loyalist citizen, which caused many of them to desert the British Army. Burgoyne now, with just over 7,000 men left, continued his advance towards Saratoga, which was on the way to Albany, rather than retreat into winter quarters himself. In his first skirmish with the Americans, the British were able to gain ground, but lost another 10% of their forces. And all the while, more and more American troops were arriving into the area from all over New York and, more importantly, New England. By mid-October, the British Army was surrounded, and Burgoyne was forced to surrender. And this surrender at Saratoga would be the first major military victory of the war for the Americans. By early December, word had reached Benjamin Franklin and the other delegates from the United States at Versailles, which was a palace outside of the city of Paris in France. And what they were told was both that Philadelphia had fallen, which of course was bad news, but more importantly, that Burgoyne had surrendered at Saratoga, which was of course excellent news. Within days, King Louis XVI allowed negotiations for an alliance between France and the United States to begin. And by February of 1788, that treaty of alliance was complete, and France declared war on Britain. Within a year, Spain had allied with France, as had the Dutch Republic. And so with the threat of a wider war breaking out in Europe, at sea, in the Caribbean, and in India, George III had to give up his goal of subduing all of America. So British forces then began to pull back, abandoning Philadelphia and conducting several failed campaigns to try and reacquire New Jersey and even Connecticut. Really, for the most part, with many troops being recalled home to Britain, most of the rest of the war in America would consist of skirmishes along the frontier, and Americans generally won most of those confrontations. The final area for significant battles in terms of control of America by the British would come in the southern colonies, where Britain felt that loyalists were more numerous, and also you had the thriving tobacco trade. They were able to capture Savannah, Georgia, in December of 1778, and attack the city of Charleston, South Carolina, looting it heavily before finally capturing it in May of 1780. The capture of Charleston would effectively destroy the Continental Army in the South, and the British hoped that they could continue to remain in control there. From there, though, Lord Charles Cornwallis, the general in charge of the British Army in North America, led a march northward into North Carolina, but he was unable to gain the interior of the state and was held primarily along the coast. Learning that the majority of the American supplies in the Carolinas were passing through Virginia, he decided to launch a campaign there, hoping to cut supplies to the American Nathaniel Greene's army and prevent him from providing any assistance to Washington. With the French Navy, though, finally approaching, Washington moved to pen Cornwallis against the York River in Virginia, cutting him off from reinforcements of his own as well as supplies. Now, at first, Cornwallis wasn't particularly concerned that he was under siege, because he was expecting reinforcements to arrive from New York, not necessarily realizing that the Chesapeake Bay was completely under the control of the French Navy. But with dwindling supplies, on October 17, 1781, Cornwallis effectively had no choice but to surrender. As it turns out, his relief, his reinforcements, his supplies had left New York on that same day, but of course he would not have known that. And for Cornwallis, since he was the overall commander of all British forces in North America, his surrender to Washington and the French at Yorktown was treated as a surrender of all British troops, not just those that were directly under his command.